Croc, one of the beloved platformer game series of the late 90s and early 2000s, had about half a dozen games released on different platforms before falling into obscurity. Despite being fairly successful in its own right, we don't hear about this franchise anymore. So what the hell happened? This is what I'm going to investigate and find answers in this video. This is the rise and fall of Croc. Before talking about Croc, let me give you a little backstory of how everything began. Let me introduce you to Jeremy Elliott San, or more commonly known as Jez San, a British game programmer and entrepreneur. San became interested in computer technology and video game development in the late 70s, and in February 23, 1982, he founded Argonaut Software in his teenage years. At the beginning, San didn't start developing games immediately. He worked on security systems with British Telecom and Acorn and various other things. However, in 1984, he developed his first game, Skyline Attack, for the Commodore 64. Couple years later, in 1986, San created the game Starglider for the Atari ST and Commodore Amiga, selling hundreds of thousands of copies. With the money he earned from past projects, it helped launch Argonaut into a larger company that started hiring other people in 1986. During the early years of the NES and SNES, Argonaut started collaborating with Nintendo. Argonaut was the first developer to successfully design 3D modeling in video games, as they had success on the NES and the Game Boy via the collaboration. However, San wanted to make something bigger for the SNES, because it was more powerful hardware, and to also prove that they can create better 3D games. Nintendo agreed, so San hired chip designers and they created the Super FX chip for the SNES. The combined efforts from both Nintendo and Argonaut yielded a prototype of the game Star Fox, initially codenamed SNES Glider, which was inspired by San's past projects. This is what Jez San said after they made this deal with Nintendo. "I told them that this is as good as it's going to get, unless they let us design some hardware to make the SNES better at 3D. Amazingly, even though I had never done any hardware before, they said yes, and have me $1 million to make it happen." With the use of the Super FX chip, Nintendo was able to utilize it in many of their game releases, such as Star Fox in 1993, Stunt Race FX in 1994, Super Mario World 2, Yoshi's Island in 1995, and even Star Fox 2, which was never released on the original Super Nintendo, but instead, it got released on the Super NES Classic Edition in 2017. Argonaut Games had established their foot well in the gaming industry at this point. In the mid-1990s, the fifth generation of game consoles were starting to appear, and Jez San wanted to create something great for the Nintendo's newest gaming console at the time, Nintendo 64. The Argonaut Games team pitched a game called Yoshi Racing to Nintendo, which will be starring Mario's sidekick Yoshi from the Mario series. Nintendo was interested in the prototype Argonaut had created, but turned it down, as eventually Nintendo created their own first 3D game, Super Mario 64, in 1996. After Nintendo shut down Argonaut's pitch, it marked the end of the relationship with Nintendo. However, the team went back to rework their prototype into a new independent project, and this is where the creation of Croc begins. So the development of Croc, or fully titled as Croc, Legend of the Gobos, began. In the mid-90s, 3D technology was still extremely primitive, and it was a risky move to develop three-dimensional games at this point in time. However, the Argonaut team had assets remaining from the Yoshi Racing prototype, as well as prior experience in game development, which they were able to utilize in their own game. But Croc was going to be a platformer game, not a racing game. The team needed something to represent Croc, since they did not have the permission to use Yoshi, and in the early development, a new young computer artist, Simon Keating, who ended up working for Argonaut Games, came up with a design of Croc after sketching different potential character designs. A cutesy looking crocodile was the final design, which is how everyone remembers Croc even to this day. Croc's game mechanics were designed by Simon Keating, as well as Argonaut's lead designer Nick Cosworth, as they are somewhat comparable to that of Mario's in Super Mario 64. The level design had a mindset of making each room feel like its own individual puzzle, so that would give the player a sense of accomplishment quite often. This is further emphasized with the different collectibles found in the game, where players can return to previous stages to collect any missing items that they may have not found during their first visit. As for the plot, Argonaut did not want a damsel in distress story, as it would not fit for their crocodile protagonist. So instead, the idea is for Croc to free these furry creatures known as Gobos, as well as defeat Baron Dante, who captured the innocent Gobos and caused all the mayhem. The game's soundtrack was composed by Justin Charvona, Karen Griffin and Martin Quinn Jones. According to Jess San, the composers created so many tracks for Croc that the audio had to be compressed for them to fit all on one disc. Croc, Legend of the Gobos finally releases between September 1997 to November 1997 in Europe and North America on 3 different platforms: the original Sony PlayStation, Sega Saturn and Microsoft Windows. The game was also released on Japan under the name Croc, Pow Pow Island on December 18, 1997 on Sony PlayStation and Sega Saturn. Croc, Legend of the Gobos received mixed to positive reviews. Most of the game's features were borrowed from other titles, but the mixture worked pretty well. While some people found the game entertaining, some thought that the elements were blended in a way that yielded a moderately entertaining experience at best. Croc's graphics and scope were praised, making it an impressive technical achievement for 1997 standards, and the sound department consisted a lot of catchy tunes, as well as atmospheric sound effects. The controls were the most controversial matchup for Croc. While some described them as solid and refined, others found them inconsistent and illogical to play with. Many critics also found the camera to be a problem, as certain jump sections, especially later on, can get unnecessarily difficult at times. Despite the mixed reviews from fans and critics alike, the game sold really well. For the Sony PlayStation alone, Croc, Legend of the Gobos sold 1.57 million copies in North America, 1.79 million copies in Europe and 200,000 copies in other regions, with a total of 3.56 million units sold. There were no sales information to be found on the Japanese version of Croc, as well as the Saturn nor the PC version, but we can safely assume the total amount of Croc games sold across all the platforms is somewhere around 4 to 5 million. So the first Croc game was a huge hit for Argonaut Games, and without any hesitation, the developer team started working immediately on the sequel, Croc 2. Argonaut wanted Croc 2 to be bigger and better than its predecessor. While it featured similar gameplay to Croc 1, there were new additions put into the game. Instead of a typical level selection screen, Croc 2's levels are split across 4 Gobbo villages, which are accessible through an open hub world. The players are given missions such as rescuing Gobos, and some levels feature riding a vehicle through a course such as a race car, a speedboat and many others. The collectathon aspect of Croc also remains, as there are different collectibles such as crystals and Gobos found across the levels. Croc 2's plot mostly remained the same, but now you need to search for Croc's missing parents, as well as save the inventor Gobbo from the hands of the resurrected Baron Dante. The development team mostly remained the same, and as for the soundtrack, it was composed by Karen Griffin only for the second game. With the small spices given to the sequel, was it enough to keep the success going for the franchise? Croc 2 was finally released between June 1999 to June 2000 on the PlayStation and PC. The Japanese got the game under the name Croc Adventure on September 2nd, 1999 for the PS1. There were also plans for Croc 2 to be released first on Sega Saturn and later on the Dreamcast, but both were ultimately scrapped due to the declining commercial performance of these two systems. Croc 2 received mixed reviews upon release. The praises were given to the game's voice acting, graphics, soundtrack and scale of the game. However, the camera issues still persisted from the first game, and the overall difficulty is something heavily disliked about Croc 2. With the mixed reviews given out to Croc 2, this is how the game performed sales-wise. In comparison to the first Croc games, over 4 million copies sold, these numbers are not good at all. 410,000 copies sold in North America, 280,000 copies sold in Europe, and 50,000 copies sold in other regions, with a total of 730,000 copies sold. No sales information were found on the PC nor the Japanese version, but I would assume the total sales are somewhere around the 1 million mark. These unexpectedly low sales were a huge blow for Argonaut, and this marked the end of the console and PC games for Croc. Croc 3 was planned with a 2-page proposal which would have seen Croc training other crocodiles for their own adventures, but the project was ultimately scrapped. So Argonaut Games went to create other games instead, such as iNinja in 2003, before ultimately defunct in October 1st, 2004. But there were other developers interested in the Croc IP, as there were 2 Croc games released for the Game Boy Color, as well as 3 for the mobile phones. Let's have a quick look for these games before I come up with the final conclusion. First we have Croc for the Game Boy Color, released in June 6th, 2000 and developed by Virtucraft. The game is a side-scrolling platformer with a lot of similarities to Croc Legend of the Gobos, such as the plot and moveset given to Croc. Croc was not well received by critics however, getting mixed to negative reviews, and while there are no sales data to be found, it performed well enough for the game to justify a sequel for the Game Boy Color, known as Croc 2. The developer known as Natsume created Croc 2 for GBC, which was released between January to February 2001 in North America, Europe and Australia. Instead of being a side-scroller, Croc 2 is seen in a top-down perspective. It features similarities with the console variant of Croc 2, but emphasizes more on the puzzle-solving gameplay. While different and somewhat unique on its own right, the game actually received positive reviews. It was praised for being a step up from Croc, instead of being a generic side-scrolling platformer. Couple years passed until we would see 3 more Croc games released for mobile, both developed and published by Morphine, as we first have Croc Mobile, Jungle Rumble, released in October 2005. It's an isometric platformer game which was a common genre from its era. It featured 16 levels and Croc faces Baron Dante again in the form of 2 boss fights. Croc also carries a mobile phone, which he regularly receives calls from Gobos to help him progress. Next in 2006 we have Croc Mobile Pinball. It's a very simplistic pinball game starring Croc, as well as Gobbo, Adantini and Baron Dante on the board. You accumulate points by hitting the trees, entering the slot for Baron Dante, sliding down the snake or crystal path, and by getting any of the extra bonuses. The last official Croc game also got released in 2006, called Croc Mobile Volcanic Panic. It's another isometric platformer game featuring many stages, objectives where we rescue more Gobos, and the plot revolves around Croc saving the wedding of King Rufus and Princess Terra, which Baron Dante tries to disturb. It is said that these mobile games sold 6-figure sales in total, which helped the IP recognition to stay afloat, but still, no more Croc games were released after Croc Mobile Volcanic Panic. So, the question still remains, how did Croc, led by Jess Sand's experienced Argonaut Games team, ended up into an obscurity after a great initial start in the late 1990s? Let's break things down, step by step. While the first Croc game was a very successful game sales-wise, the second entry had a lot more to be desired. Fox Interactive, the publisher for Croc 2, announced that they had a multi-million-dollar marketing campaign for Croc 2. This included television advertising, retail support, and incentives, as well as a promotional partnership with Nabisco's Lifesaver Gummy Savers brand. John Richmond, president of Fox Interactive, had this to say about the situation. The launch of this game and the marketing campaign support stresses the significance of Croc as a franchise and a future license for Fox. This marketing campaign of Croc 2 wasn't successful though, because Croc 2's total sales barely reached the 1 million mark compared to Croc 1's over 4 million copies sold. Both Argonaut and Fox thought that it would be too risky to invest heavy amounts of money to the Croc franchise anymore, which leads us to our next subject, that is, despite the heavy loads of money lost on Croc 2, the developer Argonaut and publisher Fox could have tried to revive Croc with a third main entry, Croc 3. With enough innovation, redesign and proper execution, Croc 3 could have been a great competitor in the 6th generation of console games market. While Croc as an intellectual property is good enough to stand out on its own, the franchise still had a lot of great competitors in the field. Other game series such as Crash Bandicoot, Spyro the Dragon, Super Mario and Rayman were getting a lot of attention in the same platform genre Croc was, which definitely hurt the sales, especially Croc 2's. Many also say that these aforementioned games had a more solid, refined gameplay experience in comparison of what Croc had to offer. Later on in the Croc's lifespan, it was obvious that bigger investments were absent for Croc, with the lack of Croc 3 and the rise of the handheld and mobile entries. While most of the small budget titles were liked by the audience and critics, it may have still left a lacklusting impression in the market. Like for example, imagine if Final Fantasy had first 7 games released for consoles, and then they would release future titles on handheld and mobile platforms only. That would be a good sign, right? So, to summarize everything, the reason why Croc ultimately fell into obscurity was the commercial failure of Croc 2, not willing to take risk with Croc 3, great competition in the same style of games, and the eventual direction to handheld and mobile games only. So how does Jez San is holding up today after the defunct of Argonaut Games in 2004? After the hiatus from the video game industry in 2004, San founded Crunchy Frog Ltd, which in 2005 became an online poker company, PKR. It was a 3D online poker site that operated in legal territories in Europe, Asia and Canada, but ultimately in May 2017 it went into administration. San co-founded mobile application developer and publisher Origin 8 with game industry colleague Fu Katan that specializes in producing iPhone and BlackBerry software, which seems to be operating to this day. Upon investigating further, it seems that Jez San is no longer involved with Origin 8, so the ownership is very likely being sold to a third party. In San's LinkedIn page, it says that he was also the founder of Arc, Ninja Theory, and now works with Funfair Technologies that creates multiplayer and crypto games. So he does have a keen interest on cryptocurrency, such as Ethereum and Bitcoin, and is quote-unquote an angel investor in crypto and tech startups. With the Croc IP, it is possible that there could be remakes done in the modern gaming platforms, as Jez San, who still owns the Croc license, makes a reply tweet in June 30th, 2020 saying, "One day I'd like to remake it. I get inbound all the time from folks that want to do it. One day." So the remake has possibilities to become a reality, because Jez San is aware that there are a lot of fans who still love Croc after all these years. Even despite the fact that San isn't that much involved in the gaming industry in 2021, he and the Argonaut Games team left a pretty darn good impression in the video games department and captured the hearts of many with their beloved crocodile mascot Croc. So, thanks a lot for watching, consider to subscribe if you find my videos enjoyable, my name is Hepodix and I hope you have a wonderful day.